Okay, imagine this. You're standing right there, new apartment keys almost in hand. You can, like, practically smell the fray paint. Picture where the sofa goes.
The exciting part.
Totally. Then the landlord hands over this stack of papers, the lease. And suddenly all that excitement gets mixed with, well, a bit of panic, you know?
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
you need to sign it right now before someone else gets it. Ever felt that?
Absolutely. That tension between wanting the place and facing the paperwork, it's very common.
Well, that's exactly what we're digging into today in this deep dive.
Yeah.
We're zeroing in on something really crucial when you rent these things called standard form contracts or
Yeah.
show.
Right.
And maybe even more importantly, this protection you have before you sign. It's called the review period or onion.
Yeah, so a standard form contract in this rental context, it's basically a pre-written lease. Landlords, property managers, they use these templates over and over.
Makes sense for them, I guess. Streamlines things.
It does, but it also means they're the ones who've set all the initial terms and conditions.
Exactly. And that's where it can feel a bit lopsided.
Yeah.
Because renting, it's treated like a consumer relationship, right?
That's the legal view, yes.
And the law kind of recognizes that the landlord, the business operator, usually has more leverage, more info than you, the renter, the consumer.
Precisely. And that inherent imbalance is why certain safeguards, like this review period, are put in place.
Okay.
So our mission today really is to shed light on this specific right, your right to review that lease properly. We want you to walk away feeling, confident and informed next time you face that stack of papers.
Okay, great. So let's get into the nuts and bolts. Where does this right actually come from legally? What's backing it up?
Well, the foundation is the Consumer Protection Act. This law is broad. It protects individuals in transactions with businesses.
Hmm.
And importantly for us today, it definitely applies to these standard form residential leases when they're offered by a business like a landlord company or even an individual landlord acting as a business to you, an individual for, living purposes.
Okay, so the big Consumer Protection Act is the starting point. But I bet there's something more specific for leases, isn't there?
You're spot on. The main act talks about giving consumers a reasonable period to review standard contracts. It mentions potentially up to 30 days.
30 days. Wow.
Yeah, but for housing leases, there's a much more specific rule. It's called the matters that should and should not be included in standard form residential lease agreements.
Doubtful.
Huh? Yeah, sounds like it. But what it does is build on the act, and it mandates a specific minimum 3-day statutory review period just for residential leases.
Okay, so 3 days. That's the key number for renting a home.
That's your guaranteed minimum, yes.
Yeah,
Time to actually look it over.
got it. And just to be crystal clear in this lease situation, the business operator is the landlord, and the consumer is the tenant. Simple enough.
Exactly.
So why is this 3-day window, why is it such a big deal for, someone listening right now who's looking for an apartment?
Well, like you said earlier, it really comes down to protection. It exists because, most of the time, the landlord or their agent drafted that entire contract.
Right. They wrote the rules.
They did. And that creates a potential imbalance, what the law calls unequal bargaining power, and also information asymmetry. The landlord probably knows way more about lease law and standard practices than the average person.
So this review period is like a small attempt to level the playing field.
That's a great way to put it. It gives you, the tenant-to-be, a chance to actually read, digest, and understand what you're signing. Crucially, without that pressure cooker feeling of sign now or lose it.
Yeah, that feeling is real. You find a place you love, the last thing you want to do is get bogged down in legalese.
Totally understandable. But this period forces, or well, allows you to take that breath. And that's the real power of it. Lets you grasp your rights, your duties before you're locked in. It helps you spot things that seem off, maybe unfair clauses you might have just glossed over if you were rushing.
Okay, so we have this 3-day window. What should we actually do during that time? It's not just for letting the contract sit there, I assume?
Definitely not. It's active time, first things first. Read everything, seriously. Every single clause. Don't just check the rent and the dates. Look at the main contract and look at any attachments or addendums. Rules about guests, pets, parking, maintenance requests, community rules.
Right, the fine print can be hiding in those extra pages.
Exactly. So read it all. Then step 2 is understand it. Don't just skim. If there are terms you don't get, make a note. Focus especially on the big stuff. Rent amount, due dates, Security deposit details how much when you get it back. Also, the lease term start and end dates. Critically, who's responsible for repairs? Big repairs, small repairs. What happens if you need to leave early? Early termination clauses. And what counts as breaking the lease breach of contract terms?
Those all sound like potential conflict zones if they aren't clear up front.
They absolutely are, which leads to the next step. Check for fairness. Remember that principle of equality and mutual benefit that underpins consumer law.
Right.
Ask yourself, does this seem balanced? Is anything ridiculously one-sided? Are the penalties for, say, being a day late with rent totally excessive? Is the language about maintenance responsibilities vague?
Okay, so apply a common sense fairness test.
Pretty much. And remember, if a term is genuinely ambiguous or unclear, the general rule is it should be interpreted in your favor as the consumer.
That's good to know. What if rating something and I'm just, like, totally lost? Or something feels really off, but I'm not sure if it's standard.
That's when you ask questions and seek help. Don't be shy. Reach out to the landlord or the property manager. Ask them to explain clause X or Y.
Okay. If something feels really wrong, or if you're just not comfortable, this is the time to maybe get some outside advice. Legal aid services, tenant advocacy groups, maybe even a quick consult with a lawyer who knows tenancy law.
Get clarity before signing. Makes sense.
Absolutely. And one last very practical point. Verify the review period itself.
Yeah.
Just double check. Did they actually give you the 3 days, or did they hand you the lease and say sign here right away?
Good point. Check that they're following the rule.
If they push back on giving you the time, that itself is a bit of a red flag, isn't it?
Yeah, it would make me wonder why. Okay, so let's say we've done all that. Read it, ask questions. But what happens if the landlord just ignores the review period? Like, they give you the lease Tuesday afternoon and say they need it back Wednesday morning, less than 3 days. What recourse do we have then?
Okay, this is really the core of your rights here. You are entitled to that reasonable review period, which means at least 3 days for a residential lease.
If the landlord fails to provide that maybe no time at all, or just a day, or they pressure you constantly during that time, then legally, the terms within that standard form contract might not be considered part of the agreement. The specific phrase is "fishing."
Whoa, hang on. Really? So if they shortchange me on the review time, the stuff in the lease might not legally apply to me?
That's the potential consequence, yes. Those terms you didn't get a fair chance to review might not be binding on you. However, and this is really important, it's flexible for the tenant. Even if the landlord messed up the review period, you, the tenant, can still choose to argue that the terms should be part of the contract.
Oh, interesting. So I get to choose.
Essentially, yes. It gives you leverage. Maybe the rent is fantastic and most terms are okay, even though they rushed you. You might want the lease to be valid. You can choose to uphold it. But if there are nasty clauses in there you didn't get to properly consider, you can argue they aren't part of your deal because the review period was violated.
So their failure to give the review period weakens their ability to enforce everything. But I could still hold them to the good parts if I wanted to.
That sums it up really well. It puts the power more in your hands after the fact.
Okay.
And beyond that specific review period rule, remember the general Consumer Protection Act principles still apply. You can always challenge specific terms if they violate good faith or are obviously unfair things, like letting the landlord enter anytime without notice or making you pay for normal wear and tear. Those could potentially be deemed invalid anyway.
So the review period is one layer of protection, but the basic fairness check is always there too.
Exactly. And don't forget, government agencies can also regulate these standard contracts. They can step in and force landlords to remove unfair clauses or add necessary protections for everyone.
Right. So, okay, boiling it all down. This review period isn't just a nice to have, it's a real right. And landlords ignoring it could mean parts of the lease aren't enforceable against the tenant.
That's the crucial takeaway. It's about ensuring you have a genuine opportunity to understand what you're signing, free from undue pressure, and protecting you from being stuck with unfair terms slipped into that pile of paper.
This has been super helpful, seriously illuminating. As we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you really want listeners to carry with them about this review period?
I think the main thing is, remember, it's your right. That 3-day minimum for a residential lease, it's there specifically to protect you, the tenant. It gives you breathing room. And knowing that if a landlord doesn't respect that right, the terms they tried to impose might not stick, That gives you real leverage. Don't underestimate its importance.
Absolutely. So next time you're faced with that lease agreement, remember this conversation. See that review period not as a hurdle, but as your dedicated time to become an informed partner in the deal, not just, a signature on a line. Maybe think about it now. What questions will you make sure to ask during your next lease review? Definitely something worth considering. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive.